Welcome to Precision Technologies. I am Venkat. This is part 13 of ASP.NET MVC tutorial. In this video, we'll discuss using form collection object in MVC and its purpose. Please watch part 12 before proceeding with this video. In part 12, if you remember, we have implemented this create employee view. Notice the URL here, employee controller, create action. So within the employee controller, do we have create action method? Yes, we do. And notice that this controller action method is decorated with HTTP get attribute, meaning this controller action method will only ever respond to the get request of this URL. On the other hand, if I fill this form with some data, and then if I post this form, okay, do we really have a create action method within the employee controller which is going to respond to the post action? We don't. So obviously what is going to happen when I click this button, we get an error stating the resource cannot be found. And look at the HTTP status code 404, okay, which is nothing but the resource cannot be found, and it makes sense. Let's see how to fix this. So what do we actually want to do when we click on this button create? We want to take this employee data from this form and then save it to this database table TBL employee. Okay, so obviously the first thing to do is to create a stored procedure. So here I am creating a stored procedure. The name of the stored procedure is sp add employee, and obviously to add employee data to this table we have to have the input parameters, for name, gender, city, and date of birth. But notice that we are not having an input parameter for ID because ID is an identity column which is going to be auto computed. And the body of the stored procedure is very straightforward. All we are doing is we are inserting data into this table TBL employee into these columns, and where are the values for those columns coming from? In the form of parameters. Okay, so that's the stored procedure. That's the first step. And the next step is within employee business layer. At the moment we only have this employees property which is going to return all the employees that are present in TBL employee table. We also need a method to save the employee data to that database table. And to do that, let's add a method. So I'm going to call this public. The return type is going to be void, and let's say add employee. So we give it the employee object, and this method is going to take care of saving that employee object to the database table. And to speed things up, I have the ADO.NET code already implemented here, so let me copy and paste that into our function. And if you look at the implementation, it's very straightforward. All we are doing here is reading the connection string from web.config file. Using that connection string, we are building our SQL connection object. We are then preparing our SQL command object. So here we have the stored procedure that we just created, sp add employee, and then we are specifying the command type as stored procedure. The next step is to obviously create the input parameters and add them to the command object. So here we have the name parameter, and then gender, city, date of birth. Finally, we open the connection, execute the query, which should insert the given employee object to the database table. Okay, so that's the second change that we have to do in our project employee business layer. All right, so the next thing is obviously when I click this button, we need a create action within the employee controller, okay, which responds to the post operation. So let's go to the employee controller, and I'm going to make a copy of this create action, and I'm going to decorate this method with a HTTP post attribute, meaning this controller action method is going to respond to the post operation. Okay, so obviously when we click this button, what should happen? We should harvest the values that are present in this form, okay, and then pass them on to our add employee method within the business layer. So add employee method is going to take the business object, the employee business object. Okay, and to do that, obviously this method needs to receive the form values. And to do that, I'm going to introduce a parameter here, form collection. So we have the form collection there. So what is this form collection going to contain? So when I click this button, whatever data that is present on this form, this form collection object is going to receive them in the form of key value pairs. Okay, so if I want to retrieve, for example, let's say I want to print all the keys and their values that are present on this form. How do I do that? you can simply use a for each loop. So for each string key in form collection object dot, there is a property called all keys, and look at what is that property returning. It is returning a string array. So we are looping through all keys. Actually, let's write the key there. So key is equal to, and then let's add a space as well, and then we want the value for that key. So response.write. So we have the form collection object, and let's look at that. To retrieve the values from the form collection, we can either use an integral indexer or the name of the key. Okay, I'm going to use the key name there. So I'm going to pass the key name, which is going to return the value. Okay, and then let's put an HTML break there, so that every key pair value will be returned in its own line. Alright, with this change, let's go ahead and run this and see what we get as the output. So what we are basically doing, we are looping through each key within that form collection object, and then we are printing the key name itself and the value from the key. So let me run this and navigate to the employee index view, create new, let's populate that with some sample data, and let's click on this create button. Look at that, I get the key as name and the value is Venkat. Within that, key is gender, value is male, key is city, value is London, and key is date of birth, and the value is whatever we have entered into that form. Okay, so basically we are using this form collection object to retrieve the keys and the values. Okay, so now if we have to persist the entered employee data to a database table, all we need to do is retrieve data from this form collection object, create an employee object, and then pass it on to add employee method of this employee business layer, and that's it. Let's do that. So within this create employee method, action method, I'm going to create a new employee object. Let's call it employee, and let's specify the employee.name. So where do we get the employee object, employee name from form collection? And just to speed things up, I have this code already typed here. So let me copy this code and paste that right here. So we are taking the name from the employee object, from the form collection, and then populating the name property of the employee object. Similarly, gender, city, and date of birth. Now form collection returns, if I specify the key, it returns the data or the value within that key in the form of a string. Now here date of birth is date time, so we need to convert that to date time. Okay, so we have the employee object, and all we need to do now is create an instance of your employee business layer. So employee business layer, let's call it employee business layer is equal to new employee business layer, and then this employee business layer has got add employee method. Okay, so we need to pass the employee object, and this method will then take care of persisting the data that's present in that employee object to the database table. Okay, and once that is done, what we need to do, we need to redirect the user back to the index view, index action method, so that we can see the newly added employee. And to do that, I'm going to use a function redirect to action, and to which action we want to redirect the user, specify the name. It's the index action that is present in the employee controller, which is going to list all the employees. That's it. Let's go ahead and run this. So let's navigate to employee, create view, and then let's populate with some data. And let's click on create. Look at that, the new employee is added. Okay, now look at this code. This looks quite redundant and boring code. So do we really have to write this code every time? Let's say here, if you look at this form, it's a very simple form. I have 4 fields. Let's say there's a huge form with like 10, 15 or 20 fields. Now this is monotonous and redundant code. So do we really have to do this you know code of retrieving data from the form and then populating the business object and then sending it over to our business layer? Do we really have to do that in MVC? No, that's the job of model binders in MVC. We'll discuss about model binders in our next video session. On this slide, you can find resources for ASP.NET, C# and SQL Server interview questions. That's it for today. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.